Chapter 9 The Foothill Riders. While J. Kelly was wandering blindly on the Nevada deserts, Joyous Jack Keatley was taking the westbound mochila from Little Yank at Julesburg, Colorado, in a driving rainstorm. Jack was one of the best known and best liked of all the Pony Express riders, seldom staying long in one place. He rode nearly every route east of the Rockies at one time or another. For this first trip he had been chosen to make the 100-mile ride to Scotts Bluff on the North Platte River, where the Rockies reach their farthest out into the prairies. Barely waiting for Yank to dismount, Jack flung the mochila over his saddle, hopped to get a foot in the stirrup, and was away in a shower of splashing mud. His horse, a high-spirited thoroughbred, was nervous and eager to run, but Jack pulled him to a jolting trot. "Easy, boy, easy," he told it. "Settle down and listen to what your Uncle Jack's a-tellin' you." Keeping up a chatter of talk, Jack held his horse to a steady trot up the valley of Lodgepole Creek. At the first wolf howl, the horse reared and whirled to race away, but there was no break in the flow of Jack's chatter. He left the reins loose, giving his startled mount nothing to fight against. "Now, looky here, boy," he chuckled. "That there's just a old he-wolf a-howlin', 'cause he's wet and lonesome. He don't care nothin' 'bout you and me." Within a dozen strides, the horse's fear had passed. Taking confidence from Jack's calmness, it let itself be turned easily, then trotted on in the blackness. At the next howl, the thoroughbred hardly broke the rhythm of its gait. Leaving Lodgepole Valley on his second mount, Jack turned well to the north, quartering into the storm. Nervous and frightened at first, the thoroughbred soon settled down under Jack's soothing chatter, and held straight on at a good steady trot. After about an hour, a low roaring came from the blackness ahead. As the sound grew louder, Jack slowed to a jog and listened carefully. This would be Rush Creek, usually no more than a brook running between high banks, but now living up to its name. Suddenly the horse threw its head high. Snorted and set its feet. Jack slipped from the saddle and stood for a minute, talking to his mount and stroking its muzzle. Then he led it slowly forward, angling toward the roar of the water. When the sound seemed almost under them, the horse again snorted and set its feet. Jack didn't try to hurry it on, to find a low place in the bank, and do it in the blackness. He must make full use of his horse's sight, and that sight would be worthless if the animal were excited and afraid. When the horse had calmed down, Jack led it on, walking close beside its head and crowding it gently toward the roar, sometimes allowing itself to be crowded and sometimes crowding back. The horse let Jack lead it along the bank for several minutes. Then it set its feet again. This was what Jack had been waiting for. Here the creek must be overflowing, a low bank. Letting the reins slip through his hand, he stepped forward cautiously into shallow water, feeling for each step. He waded on until he reached the rein ends and felt the water up to his knees. Seeing that Jack was unharmed, the horse followed willingly into the water. Keeping up a steady chatter, Jack mounted, clucked, and turned the waiting thoroughbred gently to the right. When it stepped a foot off over the flooded bank, he cut the rein ends down sharply across its rump. Startled, the horse lunged forward, plunged completely under the swirling water, and came up swimming desperately. It was only a moment until it was pawing wildly to climb the far bank. Diving over its head, Jack landed in knee-deep water. He scrambled quickly to his feet and set every ounce of his 100 pounds against the bridle reins. The pull was enough to bring the struggling horse up over the steep bank. "Easy, boy, easy," Jack soothed the trembling thoroughbred. "For a couple of seconds there, I didn't know if you and me was a-goin' to cross Rush Creek or the River Jordan," stopping only to lift the sides of the mochila and drain the mail cantinas of water. Jack mounted and put his horse into a smart trot. He followed Rush Creek westward for about an hour, then turned straight into the driving rain for the long climb to the top of 30-Mile Ridge. The blackness was thinning to dull gray when he spied a faint glimmer of light. Ahead and off to his left, it was just coming daylight when he rode into Mud Springs and changed mounts. With a few words of banter to the relay man, he cantered away to the northwest. At daybreak the rain slackened, but the wind rose to a freezing gale. Here, on the high divide, it cut through Jack's wet buckskins, plastering them like a coating of ice against his body. To protect himself as much as he could, he crouched low on his horse's neck, using its head as a windbreak. Now and again he slipped from the saddle, held to a stirrup, and ran to warm himself. It seemed hours before he sighted Courthouse Rock, standing like a great cathedral on the far side of Pumpkin Creek. Pumpkin Creek was running bank full, but Jack wasted little time in crossing it. Hitting it at an old Indian ford, he led his nervous horse into the shallow water, then mounted and spurred it out into the flood. Cold as he knew the water must be, it felt warm to him when his mount plunged under, rose, and struck out for the far bank. With the crossing of Pumpkin Creek, the worst of Jack's ride was over. The last 30 miles of his route lay on the Oregon Trail, beside the North Platte River. There, in the valley, the wind was less gusty and cold, but deep mud held his speed to a jogging trot. At 1:15 on the afternoon of April 6, he rode into Scott's Bluff and passed the mochila on to Hank Avis. The westbound mochila was now 9 hours late, and Jack had lost 2 of those hours, but it was doubtful that many other men could have made his ride without losing at least 10. Hank, though boyish in size and appearance, was in his middle 30s. He had been a scout with Captain Dripp's fur trading company and knew the country and the Indians thoroughly. His 100-mile route to Horseshoe lay through the Sioux hunting grounds, and his first relay station was at abandoned Old Fort Mitchell. halfway to the Wyoming boundary. Although the mud was deep, he drove his mount hard, planning to use all its strength by the time he reached the station. Hank was within a few miles of the old fort when he suddenly pulled his horse to a stop and jumped from the saddle. Bending low, he examined a scattering of rain-filled hoof prints that pockmarked the Oregon Trail. He read them as we read a printed page. 9 Sioux Indians had raided the relay station at dawn, stolen 5 horses, and driven them into the Wildcat Mountains. Worse still, the Indians' trail had not been followed. Swinging back into the saddle, Hank spurred his tiring mount to a pounding gallop. At the old fort he found the stable empty. A wounded hostler and the keeper were barricaded in the station. They did not believe the Sioux tribe had gone on the war path, but thought this to be a part of a large raiding band out to steal a summer's supply of horses. If it was no relay station or rider on the Oregon Trail would be safe, as there was no fresh relay, and Hank's horse was almost tired. They wanted him to turn back to Scott's Bluff. Hank Avis was no man to turn back, and besides, he didn't believe the race with the Californian and Mormon riders was lost yet. There were plenty of Indians to make trouble west of the Rockies, and from the direction of the wind, the big storm might have come all the way from the Pacific Ocean. If it had, those far western riders might be as much as a day behind schedule. No, he told the keeper, I ain't runnin' from no Injuns. With a played-out horse, I maybe can't fight 'em, but I'll bet you my spurs I can keep my hair and get past 'em. Leaving the raided station, Hank raced his horse straight across the valley to the nearest spur of the Wildcat Mountains. After hiding it in a gulch where it could rest safely, he climbed to the top of a ridge, scanning the country to the west. When he was sure there were no Indians hidden in the valley beyond, he brought his horse up, looked carefully again, then mounted and raced for the next safe cover. By the Oregon Trail, the distance to Torrington, Wyoming, his next relay post, was 23 miles. If he stuck to the cover of the mountains, he would have to ride nearly 40 miles, but that was the only safe way to go with a played-out mount. All afternoon, Hank skirted the edge of the Platte Valley, hiding his horse and scouting ahead, hill by hill. Twice he saw bands of Indians on the Oregon Trail and had to circle far back into the mountains. By the time he came out of the rough country and made his run across the valley to Torrington Station, it was 2 hours after dark. The Torrington relay post was also a way station for freighters on the Oregon Trail, and was surrounded by a strong stockade. Hank found 2 freighting outfits forted up in the stockade, and the drivers badly frightened. They reported bands of mounted Sioux all along the trail to the west, some of them in war paint. Hank wouldn't even stop for coffee. The storm seemed to be breaking a little, and he was anxious to be on his way. He knew these outlying foothills of the Rockies as well as a villager knows his hometown. With a few stars to guide himself by, he could easily get around any Indians camped along the trail. The horse Hank drew at Torrington was strong and willing, and he pushed it along at a fast pace, as the rough going would allow. Back in the hills he had little worry of running into an ambush, and made the 30-mile ride to Fort Laramie in less than 4 hours. It was just midnight when he blew his horn to wake Seth Ward, the station keeper. "What in tarnation be you a-doin' here?" Seth shouted as he opened the gate. "Don't you know there's Injun raiders scattered all abouts? Ain't saw an Injun since I ever crossed the Nebrasky line," Hank shouted back. "Wrastle me out a horse, and a good one. The way I'm a-goin', it'll be 30 tough miles to Horseshoe. From Fort Laramie to Horseshoe Station, there was little peace for a rider to keep hidden. The country was open rolling prairie, and even in starlight, a rider could be seen at a long distance." Again Hank went back to leaving his horse and scouting from each hilltop before he crossed it. 2 or 3 times he spied a flicker of light from an Indian campfire, and had to ride far around it. But he wasted no minute that he could help. At 4:30 on the morning of April 7th, he rode his well-spent horse into the Horseshoe relay station. The westbound mail was now 12 hours late, but the race was far from over. Chapter 10. Mormon Riders of the Desert. It almost seemed that the weather, as well as the Indians, had conspired against the first riders of the Pony Express. Spring showers are to be expected along the valley of the Platte River, but storms lasting several days are uncommon. In the deserts, they are almost unheard of. Springtime there is usually bright and sunny, often hot. But in April of 1860, storm clouds stretched across the whole western half of the continent, bringing with them pitch-black nights, blizzards, and endless days of heavy rain. From the time the eastbound mail had left San Francisco, the only break in the clouds had been at Lake Tahoe, when at 9 o'clock on the morning of April 6, J. Kelly passed the Mochila on to Wash Perkins at Ruby Valley. A cold rain was setting in. Ruby Valley was the dividing point between the California and Mormon riders, and the rivalry between them was keen. They would stand together in the race against the riders to the east of the Rockies, but each group was determined to set the fastest record on its section of the trail. To Wash Perkins, still in his teens, it seemed that the rain had held off just long enough to ruin the Mormon boys' chance against the Californians. Major Howard Egan was superintendent of the Mormon division of the Pony Express. He had pioneered most of the pony trail across the deserts and badlands, built the relay stations, and carefully chosen the riders from among the members of his own church. Each one was a boy in his late teens, light in weight, fearless, trail-wise, honest, and determined to prove that the Mormon horsemen were the best in the world. To help his riders, Major Egan had supplied them with the finest horses in the Mormon stables and divided the 242-mile trail between Ruby Valley and Camp Floyd into 4 short routes. The trail laid out for Wash Perkins' route to Shell Creek was little more than 60 miles long, but crossed 2 alkali flats and 3 rugged mountain chains. When practicing, Wash had twice ridden the route in 5 hours. As he snatched the mochila from Jay and raced away from the Ruby Valley station, he made up his mind to beat that record in spite of the rain. Bent low in his saddle, Wash streaked across Ruby Valley, heading straight for the canyon that led steeply up to the pass across the first mountain range. But with every stride of his pony, the rain fell harder. It had become a deluge by the time he raced into the canyon mouth, and a shallow creek was rushing down the trail. Wash paid no attention to the water, but whipped his pony through it and splashed on toward the steep rise to the pass. He fought his way upward until he was halfway to the summit. There the canyon narrowed, and the creek became a raging torrent, too swift for the pony to climb through. After his mount had fallen twice, Wash had no choice but to turn back to the valley. With nearly an hour lost in trying to get over the mountains, Wash was disappointed but not discouraged. Although he would miss both of his relay posts and have no change of mounts, he would add only 20 miles to his ride by circling the ends of the ranges. The scheduled time for his route was 9 hours, and he believed he could still reach Shell Creek on time. He might have made it after the first downpour. The storm hadn't settled into a steady, soaking rain that turned the alkali flats into hoof-deep mud. Even though he had no Indian trouble, and the ride he made that day was a marvelous one, it was deep twilight before he reached Shell Creek. Darkness and steady rain were falling when Jim Gentry took the mochila from Wash. Jim's 60-mile trail lay through the desolate Antelope Mountains, across 24 miles of badlands, over another high ridge, and down to Deep Creek Relay Station in Utah Territory. By looking at the Pony Express schedule, anyone unfamiliar with the route might have believed that 9 hours had been allowed for the eastbound run, but this was not the case. The time zone follows the Utah-Nevada line, so Jim would lose an hour through starting his ride by Pacific time and ending it by Mountain time, which is an hour later. Under good conditions, this loss of an hour would not have bothered Jim. Although the country was rugged, his trail was a reasonably easy one in daylight and fair weather. He had made several practice runs in 5 hours each, but in dead blackness and rain the ride could be almost a nightmare. He was anxious and watchful as he rode away into the storm. Regardless of the weather, Indians lay in wait for Jim at the pass through the antelopes. He saw none of them, but the flicker of their campfires drove him far from the trail, into wilderness, where every step was treacherous. 6 or 7 times his pony slipped and went down in the grease-slick mud of the badlands. Each time the pony got up unhurt and Jim was able to jump clear, but he was definitely worried. A horse could easily break a leg in those quick falls, and without the help of its sight, in that blackness, the chance of getting the mail through would be small. There would be no possibility of reaching a relay station before morning, and afoot in daylight there would be no hope of escaping the Indians. It was 6:10 a.m. by the keeper's watch when Jim rode into the Deep Creek station, dead tired and covered from head to heels with mud. His knowledge of the Badlands, good luck, and the sturdiness of his ponies were all that had saved the mail, but more than 3 hours had been lost on the scheduled time for his run. Taking the mud-smeared mochila from Jim Gentry, Let Huntington carried it over a 6,000-foot pass in the Deep Creek Mountains and down to the Great Salt Lake Desert. In dry weather he could have raced straight across to his home station at Simpson Spring, but the rain had turned the desert into a sea of salt-crusted, putty-like mud that would cripple a horse within a mile or two. Let had no choice but to circle the salt flats, hugging close to the base of the surrounding mountains, and each one of them proved to be an Indian ambush. Let Huntington's reputation as a crack shot was well known to the Indians. They had no courage to meet him in the open, but from ambush they used him for target practice. Hemmed in by mountains on one side and salt flats on the other, he could not avoid the ambushes. His only defense was to fling himself along the far side of his pony, race past each one, and outdistance any mounted Indians that followed him. This was one time when the Indians helped to speed the Pony Express. They kept Let racing for his life. With 2 changes of mounts, he ran every gauntlet safely, and at noon turned the mochila over to Billy Fisher at Simpson Spring. Billy Fisher was to see plenty of Indian trouble in the months ahead, but he had none on his ride to Camp Floyd, the army post, near the western shore of Utah Lake. Instead, he had rain, mud, and disappointment. His route lay through the rich farmlands of Rush Valley, softened into black muck. One of the fastest of the Mormon riders, he had determined to set a record on this run, but the ride he hoped to make in 4 hours took 7. It was 6:30 on the night of April 7 when he brought his plodding pony into Camp Floyd. To Billy, the race with the riders from the east seemed hopelessly lost. Chapter 11. The Rocky Mountain Riders. Jim Gentry was still floundering through the grease-slick badlands of Nevada when at 4:30 on the morning of April 7, Hank Avis galloped his spent pony into Horseshoe Station, high in the Wyoming foothills of the Rockies. "Watch out for Sioux. They're thicker in fleas on a coyote," Hank shouted to Bill Cates as he sprang from the saddle. "You fight shy o' the trail, and keep a sharp eye peeled, kid." Bill slapped the mochila across his saddle and vaulted up, but before opening the gate to let him out, the old keeper shouted, "Don't you pay him no mind, Billy, just like I been tellin' you. There's a blizzard a-comin' on, but it'll be mostly this side o' Deer Creek. Injuns knows enough to hole up in a blizzard. You stick to the trail and burn leather for Platte Bridge." Bill Cates, just out of his teens, was an Illinois plainsman, but he had been in the Rockies 2 years and knew the Oregon Trail well. What he didn't know was whether to follow the advice of the weather-wise old keeper or the cautioning of Hank Avis, one of the best scouts of the Rockies. The blackness of the night convinced him to take the keeper's advice, at least on the 20-mile ride to La Bonte Creek, his first relay post. He held close to the Oregon Trail, saw no Indian campfires, and drove his mount to the very limit of its strength. Daylight came when he was halfway, and with it a freezing wind sprang up, whipping icy particles of snow before it. At La Bonte Creek, the Platte River turns sharply to the north, circling the La Ramie, Haystack, and Casper mountain ranges. To follow the river around would make Bill's ride to Box Elder Station 30 miles. By striking due west and hugging the foothills, he could cut the distance to 20, and believed he could outrun the blizzard that was surely coming. Beyond Box Elder, he'd have only a 10-mile ride to Deer Creek, then 30 more to Platte Bridge. Bill laid the rein ends sharply across his mount's rump, lifting the pony into a sharp gallop, and heading straight for the foothills. He'd not only outrun the storm, he'd make Platte Bridge by noon, and be in Red Buttes, his home station, by 1:30. Let's see, that would knock 3 hours off the scheduled time for his run. This race with the Californians and Mormons wasn't lost yet, not by a little brown jug full. Bill was so busy with his thinking that he didn't notice the increasing violence of the storm until he had reached the base of the Laramies. To protect himself and his horse, he reined closer in among the foothills. Within a half hour the wind was so filled with snow that he could see no more than 20 rods, and in the rough going his horse began to tire rapidly. He had to let it slow down to a trot, then to a jog. Within another hour Bill began to worry. The wind seemed to have gone crazy. It was veering wildly, striking from either side and straight on, and it was impossible to tell direction by it. Any way he turned, he found a rocky hillside. Snow was piling up in the gulches, and he could barely see 60 feet. He had turned his tired horse and was trying to find his way out of the foothills when he discovered a rapidly flowing creek. "Doggone," he shouted. "Don't reckon I was so far off at that. This here'll be Box Elder Creek. All I got to do is foller it down to the depot." Hour after hour, Bill followed the creek out of the foothills and across a wide valley. Shivering, he pulled the buckskins high around his neck, hunched his head, and kept his weary horse going at the best pace it could manage in the deepening snow. He had lost all track of time, and his mind was numb with cold when he came to the end of the creek. It emptied into the Platte just above a downstream bend to the right. Bill Cates needed no one to tell him that he had never reached the Box Elder. but had followed La Prelle Creek to the northeast and was little nearer Red Buttes than he had been at dawn. In his drowsiness he had crossed the snow-covered Oregon Trail without seeing it, and had ridden nearly 10 miles beyond. Twilight was falling when Bill at last reached Box Elder Station. He was already 2 hours overdue at Red Buttes, but more than 50 miles of blizzard-ridden trail still lay ahead of him. Half frozen and starved, he would neither stop to get warm nor let the keeper carry the mail on for him. Gulping down a few mouthfuls of antelope stew, he swung onto his saddle and rode back into the storm. Although the wind was still strong and snow-filled, there were no deep drifts in the Platte River Valley. Leaving Box Elder, Bill stuck close to the Oregon Trail and kept his horse at a steady trot. Night overtook him long before he reached Deer Creek, but with darkness the wind eased. Beyond Deer Creek the air cleared, the blackness of the night faded, and here and there a star peeped through the clouds. With each mile that Bill rode, the depth of snow on the ground lessened. The blizzard hadn't reached this far to the northwest. "Derned big head," Bill mumbled to himself. "If I'd a listened to the old man and not tried to cut corners, I'd have outrode that blizzard and been in Red Buttes hours ago. Well, what's done is done, and there's no use bawlin' over it. Get along, old pony. There's hay in the barn at Platte Bridge." When an hour before midnight he rode into Platte Bridge Station, the whole sky was a twinkle with stars. Across the river and up on a fine horse, he set out rapidly on the last leg of his route. In the bright starlight he had no trouble in following the Oregon Trail, and his mount held willingly to a good pace. But by the time he reached Red Buttes and tossed the mochila to Irish Tommy Ranahan, the mail was nearly 20 hours behind schedule. Irish Tommy, little bow-legged and spry as a grasshopper, was no boy. Ever since the California gold discovery, he had been guide, bull-whacker, mule skinner, or stage driver on the Oregon Trail. He knew the Sweetwater River Valley as no other man knew it, and called it his stomping ground. If the whole world had been searched, no better man could have been found to carry the pony mail to the top of the Continental Divide. His 140-mile route to South Pass was the longest and one of the most dangerous in the entire 1,966 miles of the Pony Express Trail. He had no use for race horses, but demanded mustangs as rough as the country they would be running through. When from half a mile Tommy heard the sound of Bill Cates' horn, he ran for the corral with his rope swinging. By the time Bill rode in, a mustang was saddled, bridled, and a helper was holding it by the ears so it couldn't fight. Bill's boots had barely touched the ground before Tommy grabbed the mochila, flung it over his saddle, and vaulted up. With his feet still feeling for the stirrups, he shouted, "Turn him loose and let him shake." The helper let go and jumped back. The station keeper swung the corral gate open, and the wildly bucking bronco went through it like a cat in a fit, flailing his hat and shrieking like an Indian. On the warpath, Irish Tommy spurred the mustang from shoulder to rump. Unable to shake him loose, the bronco tried to run away from the biting spurs. Crow-hopping through the stockade gate, it raced up the trail at breakneck speed. Tommy stopped spurring as soon as the bronco settled in to a run, but he didn't try to slow it down or spare it. This was a Wyoming Badlands Mustang, used to taking care of itself. He'd run until a man might think he was ready to drop, but he'd always keep back a reserve of hidden strength. From Red Buttes, the trail twisted upward along the edge of the rushing Platte River, hugging close to the foot of the Rattlesnake Mountain range. With 4 or 5 inches of snow on the ground, it was a climb that would have tired most horses within a few miles, but not this Badlands Mustang. As soon as he was away from the station, he settled into a steady lope, breaking it only at the steepest climbs or to flounder through snowdrifts. Tommy expected no Indian trouble, but from habit his eyes searched the mountainside ahead. Unlike Jack Keatley, Tommy rode in silence, and with snow to muffle his pony's hoofbeats, they moved soundlessly through the starry night. At the Fiery Narrows, 30 miles out of Red Buttes, the Mustang dropped its head and began to weave in its gait. Knowing that it still had a reserve of strength, Tommy spurred the bronco sharply, running it hard for the last 2 miles into Sweetwater Relay Station. With a stout Mustang under him, Tommy left the Platte and turned into the foothills of the Granite Mountains, following up the north bank of Sweetwater River. Here the trail was rough and dangerous, but the run to Devil's Gate was only 20 miles, and Tommy kept his pony at a brisk canter. Nearly 2 hours later, and in the dim gray light of early morning, he passed Independence Rock, the great landmark of the Oregon Trail, where hundreds of immigrants had stopped to scratch their names in the granite. Daylight had broken clear and cold when he circled Devil's Gate and cantered his exhausted pony into his second relay station. Irish Tommy's third Mustang was even wilder than his first. It had taken 4 men to saddle it, and it left the Devil's Gate station in an explosion of frantic bucking, but Tommy would have no other horse. Ahead lay the 28 most rugged miles of his route, and it would take a tough bronco to run it at a speed of 9 miles an hour. The trail clung tight against the rocky rim of the Granite Range. The climbs were steep, and at 3 crossings the river snaked through a canyon so narrow that 3 fordings had to be made within a mile. Tommy allowed himself 3 hours for the ride, and reached the 3 crossing station almost on the minute. From 3 crossings westward, the Sweetwater River Valley spread out into broad meadows, where great herds of deer, elk, and antelope grazed. This was easy going. There was little snow on the trail, and Tommy held his mount to a steady canter, covering the 32 miles to the St. Mark's relay post in 3.5 hours. Irish Tommy had already put 110 miles behind him, enough to wear out any man, and 30 more still lay ahead. Stopping at St. Mark's only long enough to wolf down a bowl of venison stew, he swung back into the saddle and hit the trail for South Pass, the top of the Continental Divide and the end of his route. At St. Mark's the green meadows were left behind, and dry, rolling prairies rose in steps to the top of the divide. Off to the south the Antelope Hills raised their snowy tops against the clear sky, and from the north a cutting wind swept down from the high Wind River Mountains. For this last climb Tommy had chosen a strong, well-knit Mustang, and planned to spare it a little on the early part of his ride. He was sitting loose in the saddle, half drowsing, when suddenly he came to attention. He shaded his eyes and carefully examined a dry gulch ahead, and off to his left he could see nothing, but was sure his eye had caught some movement there. Caution, born of long years in the mountains, warned him. He touched spurs to his pony and turned it off the trail, giving the gulch a wide berth. Suddenly, as if boiling out of the ground, a band of yelling Indians raced their ponies out of the gulch. Shoshones, Tommy muttered to himself, dropped low in the saddle and spurred sharply. Gathering its muscles, his Mustang leaped away in a burst of speed. Then, from behind, the sound of rifle fire cut through the yelling. Tommy was no more afraid than if the Indians had been shooting pop guns at him. He glanced back over his shoulder just long enough to be sure his Mustang was outdistancing the Indian ponies. As the Indians gave up the chase, Tommy shouted a few choice insults at them, then swung his pony back to the trail and rode on as though nothing had happened. At 4:50 on the afternoon of April 8, he slid his sweat-streaked Mustang to a stop in front of the South Pass relay station. He had ridden his whole route in exactly the scheduled time, but the westbound mail was still nearly 20 hours late. "Shake a leg now, lad," Tommy shouted to Deadwood Dick as he hauled the mochila off his saddle. "This race ain't over yet. Not at all, at all. Like as not, them Mormon boys is bogged down in the mud of Great Salt Lake. It's all downhill from here to Bear River, bub, and we got 'em licked." Chapter 12. The Mormon Riders of Utah. When, at 6:30 on the rain-swept night of April 7, Billy Fisher plodded into Camp Floyd, Major Howard Egan flung the eastbound mochila across his own saddle, mounted, and galloped away into the darkness. Since there was no faster means of communication than the Pony Riders themselves, he had no way of knowing that the storm extended halfway across the continent, that the riders east of the Rockies had been running late, or that Bill Cates had spent most of the day lost in a blizzard. For all Major Egan knew, a westbound rider might already be across South Pass and racing toward the goal at the Bear River Ford. Actually, the western riders were well ahead of schedule. Bart Riles and Jay Kelly had lost little more than half of the time gained in the amazing ride that the California boys had made to Fort Churchill. Then, too, Let Huntington had made up all the time lost by Jim Gentry, but the Major was greatly concerned by his Mormon riders having fallen far behind his expectations. Some desperate riding would have to be done if the Mormons were to hold up their end of the race, riding more dangerous than he would assign to any man but himself. A fine paved highway now connects Utah Lake and Salt Lake City. In 1860, a rough army road followed the same route, and the creeks and rivers were bridged. With reins barely taut enough to help a stumbling horse catch its balance, the Major turned onto the Army Road. Salt Lake City lay 75 miles to the north, and 2 fast horses were waiting at the relay stations, evenly spaced along the way. Unable to see his own hands in the blackness, Major Egan kept his mount at the fastest pace its strength could endure for a 25-mile run, although he knew that one misstep in the sloppy going might break both their necks. He gave his horse free rein, trusting thoroughly in its sight and intelligence. Good horses are like good men. They know instinctively when genuine confidence is placed in them, and repay it with their finest efforts. All 3 horses Major Egan rode that night were top string, and they repaid his trust with every ounce of their strength and courage. The Major had saved his fastest and toughest mount for the home stretch. It was a high-strung, wiry plains pony, and held to a pounding gallop for the first 23 miles of its relay. Then, 2 miles away, the lights of Salt Lake City suddenly showed through the blackness. A moment later, Major Egan heard his pony's hoofs clatter on the plank bridge over Mill Creek. Instantly, the saddle dropped from under him, water splashed into his face and swirled around his knees. But he kept his seat. The bridge was at a curve in the road, just beyond a willow thicket. The speeding pony glancing up when the lights came into view. Had overshot the bridge and leaped off into the creek. Without losing its footing, it scrambled up the bank, caught its stride, and galloped on to the home station at the Salt Lake house. The chime clock in the lobby was just striking 11:45 when Major Howard Egan pulled up at the hotel entrance. One of the greatest horsemen of all time, he had ridden 75 miles through mud, rain, and darkness in 5 hours and 15 minutes, cutting the scheduled time for his route by more than half. The ride he made that storm-lashed night will long stand as a landmark in American horsemanship and courage. Ross Egan took the mochila from his father at the Salt Lake house, but he had no military road to follow eastward through the high Wasatch Mountains. His route was along the deep wheel ruts of the old Mormon trail, climbing high on a mountainside. He left the lights of the city behind and plunged into the blackness of Immigration Canyon, barely wide enough in some places to let a wagon through. The canyon wound between towering rock walls, to Donner Hill. At its far end, a trot was the best pace Ross could hold through the gorge, up Donner Hill and over Little Mountain. In the darkness and rain, the stiff climb to the crest of Big Mountain had to be made step by slow step, trying to make up time. Ross put his pony down the far side at a dangerous trot, then turned on to Dutchman's Flat. Rich black farmland, the flat was soaked until it had become a bog of foot-deep gummy mud. There was no way around, and the pony could wade no more than 40 lengths without a rest. The sky was turning gray in the east when Ross brought his exhausted mount into the relay station at Snyder's Mill. In 5 hours of hard riding, he had covered barely 25 miles. With a fast pony under him, Dutchman's Flat behind, and daylight coming on, Ross Egan set out to make up some of the time he had lost. The rain was letting up a little, and with a relay at Dixie Creek, there was no need to spare his ponies. Bent low in his saddle and coaxing every possible inch of speed from his mounts, Ross streaked across the hills, through the cheering little settlement of Webster past Hanging Rock, and between the high red cliffs of Echo Canyon. There was no hope of equaling his father's record, but together the Egans had nearly halved the good weather schedule on their runs. In 12.5 hours they had carried the mail 125 miles over one of the country's highest mountain chains. Through darkness, mud, and pouring rain, it was a few minutes before 7 when Ross reined in his dripping pony at the Echo Canyon relay station and tossed the mochila to Tom King. Tom was in his late teens, weighing barely 100 pounds, and was noted for being the fastest rider among all the Mormon boys. It was for this reason that Major Egan had chosen him for this particular route. His was the sprint run. Midway to Fort Bridger, his trail crossed Bear River. Goal in the race against the riders from east of the Rockies. The first 30 miles of Tom's route lay through rough country on the eastern slope of the mountains, but he kept his pony at a stiff gallop over most of the way. At any time now, the rider from the east might be expected to reach Bear River. And with the race so nearly won, Tom had no intention of being beaten. With a change of mounts at Needle Rock, he climbed to the high Wasatch Pass at a horse-killing trot. From the summit he could see far over into Wyoming territory. Between flowed Bear River, but the trail on either side was hidden by hills or woods. Tom knew that somewhere along that unseen strip of trail a rider might be driving desperately for the goal, and that the race could yet be lost. He urged his leg-weary pony down from the pass at a speed that was close to being foolhardy. After reaching the valley, he kept the line ends slashing. The ford was only a half-mile ahead, but cottonwoods along the river still hid it from sight. He could not be sure that the western riders had won the race until his pony galloped between the trees and the rain-swollen river lay before him. Then, horseman that he was, he cooled the sweating pony out before putting it through the ice-cold water. Even though the race with the eastern riders had been won, the big race, the race against time, was still far from finished. unless the mail was delivered at each end of the 1,966-mile trail within the 10-day limit set by Mr. Russell. His promise to the United States government would be broken, and the Pony Express might become a failure. But the riders of the Pony Express would sacrifice their lives before they would accept failure, regardless of weather, danger, or what route must be ridden. There would be no letting up until the whole job was done, and done well. When Tom King rode out of Bear River Valley, Wyoming lay before him in a great gully-slashed hills. Here the footing was good, the rain had stopped, and Tom kept his pony at a swinging canter. The sun was less than an hour past mid-sky when he forded Muddy Creek, made a quick relay, and galloped away on the last leg of his route to Jim Bridger's old fort. Dan Westcott was waiting anxiously when Tom rode in. For hours he'd been watching the trail, but there was still no sign of the overdue rider with the mail from St. Joseph. "Bet a hat I beat him to Green River," he shouted as he swung into the saddle and galloped away down Black Fork Creek. Dan's pony was a tough, hard-bited Badlands Mustang, but he held it down to a swinging canter. The run to Granger Settlement, his first relay post, was 30 miles, and there was nothing between but coyotes, antelope, and prairie. 10 miles an hour was as fast as he dared let the Mustang go. A played-out pony in that lonely country could delay the mail for hours and cost him a long walk. Everyone in Granger was gathered around the relay station. When Dan cantered in, swung the mochila over the saddle of his relief pony, and galloped away. Now, with a fresh horse waiting at Rock Ridge, and another at the Green River crossing, he could turn on the speed. The sun was already low in the west, and he wanted to gain every mile he could before darkness fell. Leaving Black Fork Valley, he spurred up the long divide to Rock Ridge, made a lightning-fast relay, and raced down to the Valley of the Green, tossing the mochila upon a waiting mount. Dan crossed Green River and turned up the Big Sandy toward South Pass. The trail followed the river valley all the way to Big Sandy Stage Station, but Dan didn't. By cutting straight across the hills and making 2 or 3 extra fordings, he could save several miles. He had made his first cutoff, forded the river, and was well up the next hill, when, from the valley below, he heard the music of a running horse's hoofs. "Yahoo, pony!" he hooted into the darkness. A moment later, Deadwood Dick's answer came back, almost like an echo. "Yahoo, pony!" Unseen, the riders from east and west had passed where only the coyotes could hear their hooted greeting. In the months that were to come, the riders from east of the Rockies would win many a race, but all the glory of the first one belonged to the Californians and Mormons. The eastbound mail was more than 14 hours ahead of schedule when the riders passed, shortly after 9 o'clock on the night of April 8, and the westbound mail was nearly 20 hours late. The deep mud and wild country had proved to be too much for the fine-bred eastern race horses, while the tough western mustangs had more than met every demand made upon them. but the race between the riders and horses of east and west was of little moment. The big race against time had yet to be won. The big race was won gloriously, and again all the honors went to the Westerners, racing the St. Joseph Mail westward across mountains and deserts. They made up time on every relay until at last the whole 20 hours had been whittled away. At 5:30 p.m. on April 13th, 9 days, 15 hours, and 15 minutes from the time he had dashed away with the eastbound mochila, Sam Hamilton galloped back into Sacramento with the first Pony Express mail from the east. This time a cheering throng jammed J Street, and a wildly shouting troop of horsemen hemmed Sam in from either side. While the Mormons and Californians had been racing toward Sacramento, the Prairie Riders were fighting their way eastward through still deep mud. Although they lost most of the time originally gained by the Westerners, they brought the San Francisco Mail into St. Joseph well ahead of schedule at 3:55 p.m. on April 13th. Johnny Frey, again rigged out in his fancy clothes, clattered up Jewel Street, leaped from the saddle, and passed the mochila into Mr. Russell's waiting hands. The riders of the Pony Express, both east and west of the Rockies, had proved that in spite of rain, mud, blizzards, and Indians, the mail could go through in 10 days. William Russell had promised